Hello, this is Terrence McNally. Following the largest single day of protest in American history, 7 million turned out for over 2,700 No Kings rallies across all 50 states. Here are a couple of archived episodes that seem timely. First, my 2004 conversation with Thomas Frank about his provocative and groundbreaking classic, What's the Matter with Kansas? Frank looks to his traditionally red-voting native state to examine the GOP's success in building unnatural alliances between blue-collar Midwest and Wall Street, between workers and bosses, between populists and right-wingers. In the second half, you'll hear my 2010 conversation with Paul Loeb about his book, Soul of a Citizen, Living with Conviction in a Challenging Time. Loeb recommends a new kind of activism, an exciting spiritual model for creating social change, and the book's full of moving stories of ordinary Americans finding unexpected fulfillment in social involvement. Hello, I'm Terry McNally. Thank you for joining us on Free Forum. Why does a factory worker who listens to Rush Limbaugh consistently vote for a political party less likely to protect his safety, his job, and his pension? In What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America, author Thomas Frank returns to his native state to examine Republican success in building an alliance, an unholy alliance, between blue-collar Midwesterners and Wall Street multimillionaires. Thomas Frank joins me on Free Forum in a couple of minutes. Why does the pro-life Kansas factory worker who listens to Rush Limbaugh repeatedly vote for that party? Why do blue-collar workers all over America embrace a moral agenda focused on things like opposition to abortion and gay marriage and support for school prayer consistently vote against their own interests? As Democrats and Republicans battle for voters in swing states, Thomas Frank looks to his traditionally red-voting native state of Kansas to examine the GOP's success in building those alliances. What can the Sunflower State tell us about why struggling Americans would vote for Republicans and against their own families and their futures? Now, here on Free Forum, we explore the lives, the work, and the ideas of individuals that I suspect hold pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, and provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, and media, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Thomas Frank, What's Wrong with Kansas? The bio on his own website reads, "Born on the wild plains of Kansas, Tom pulled himself up by his bootstraps, learned to read, write, and cipher. He likes big steaks, barbecue, and most other meat dishes." Now, let me also add that he's the founding editor of The Baffler, and that's www.thebaffler.com, a book of essays and critiques of culture. He's also the author of a couple of really good books, One Market Under God and The Conquest of Cool. And he was a guest on this show previously when The Conquest of Cool came out, which is an analysis of advertising basically primarily since the 50s and 60s, and the co-optation of the rebel posture by advertisers to use the very fact that people might want to rebel as a way to stimulate their consumption. He's a contributor to Harper's, The Nation, and the New York Times op-ed page. Welcome again, Thomas Frank, to Free Forum.
How you doing, Terrence?
I'm good.
That was pretty funny that you read that bio. We put that up there as a joke, and then I just never got around to taking it down.
Well,
I learned to read, write, and cipher.
That's right, and I figured you probably did.
Yeah.
You've been ciphering good ever since you got to the University of Chicago.
That's right.
So first, briefly, Thomas, I always want to ask people a bit about their own past so that listeners get to know the people behind the ideas and the work. Now, what were you like growing up in Kansas? When did you leave, and what made you return there to write this book?
Okay, good question. I grew up in a very affluent suburb of Kansas City, and I was a teenage conservative, if you can imagine that. very different person than I am today. Although I still liked barbecue, steaks, and most other meat dishes. To refer to that
Yes.
facetious. Okay, but anyhow. I was a big fan of Ronald Reagan, if you can imagine that. And what had happened, as I look back on those years, I sort of internalized the politics of the world that I was growing up in. The adults around me who were all businessmen and all very well-to-do, and regarded things like taxation as being fundamentally illegitimate. Government was just a nest of criminals, and so were labor unions and all this sort of thing.
Right. Let me just tell you, Thomas, that I think in our teenage years we have all sorts of motivations. I recall my parents both being from Massachusetts, both being Catholic, both being lifetime Democrats. I actually was the one in the household who said, well, this Nixon guy isn't so bad, in 1960.
Wow.
We rebel in whatever ways we can, or we go along in whatever ways we can.
Yeah,
Continue.
I was basically going along,
Yeah.
and what changed it for me was when I got out into the wider world and discovered that business wasn't the kind of perfect meritocracy that these adults had told me that it was, and that the free market system it wasn't It wasn't a system that just rewarded people based strictly on their merit and and was fair and all that. So, I mean, all the usual things. And this occurred to me when I finally, and so I left Kansas for good about 1987 and moved to Chicago. And why did I go back there to write this book? Well, what happened was in about '99 or the year 2000 or something like that, a friend of mine, I was at a wedding, and a friend of mine from Kansas City was getting married, and he said, he had kept in touch with all the political goings on there, and he said, those people that you grew up around, that you used to think were the most Republican people you would ever meet. Well, those people are now, the people in this affluent suburb that I was describing earlier, well, those people are now on the left edge of the spectrum back in Kansas, and because the state has moved so far to the right. And that was about the same time as the evolution issue. Kansas decided they would fight over evolution again.
Right.
And that was making national headlines, and that's when I said, "Wow, I should I should look into this and see what's happened there." And it sort of coincided with my larger historical interest in the problem of, or the mystery of, blue collar conservatism, populist conservatism.
Right. Let me say that one of the reasons that I wanted to talk with you. I got the book, looked at the book, saw you on C-SPAN and so on. But you're focusing on one of the questions that most troubles me about politics and democracy over at least the last 30, 35 years, okay, which is people voting against their own interests. Last year, I was asked to guest on a radio show, and the subject was the future of the Democratic Party. I said, I'm not really that interested in the horse race of the future of the Democratic Party. I said, what I'm interested in is what would it take to once again have a party in this country that would do two things, that would serve the interests of the majority of Americans, and that would find a way to successfully communicate that fact to voters.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you're.
Isn't that funny? And that seems like such a rational thing to want. It seems so normal. And yet,
that's kind of what you're after in this, right?
Oh yeah, of course. And that's so far. I mean, it's farther from being reality than ever, in my opinion. That we have wandered off into a place where we are so distant from that, where our politics are all about these cultural issues, and if they aren't, then we, if the Democrats start, heaven forbid, return to their roots and start talking about workplace issues and this kind of thing, then we have one of our two big political parties is standing by, ready to invent some new hot button cultural issue to bring us back onto the path. This year looks like it's going to be gay marriage is going to be the big thing.
Right, and when you give, or not give, but when a group decides that they've got a quiver, just a shopping cart full of cultural issues, and then they've got terrorism. They've got an awful lot of stuff that can sort of fog the mind, don't they?
Oh yeah. And
now let me see if your numbers are the same as mine. I thought that there were still fewer registered Republicans than Democrats. You, I think somewhere I read, said that it was maybe they'd passed them.
If I did, I think I was in error, because I saw the numbers on that the other day, and there are still more Democrats than Republicans, but it's the margin has been closing since the 70s.
And as the independents and fail to choose grows.
what is the Republicans have been moving up slightly. The Democrats have been dropping like a rock, and that's basically what's happening.
Right. Let me lay out a big question, and then let me identify the show while you get your answer ready. Okay. So this is it. What we're saying then is the Republicans still a slightly fewer Republicans and Democrats, yet the right dominates the White House, the Senate, the House, the Supreme Court, much of the rest of the federal courts, the military, a majority of governorships, and one could say, depending on one's interpretation of media, perhaps the media. And how have they been able to do it? Now, let me tell people that you're listening to Freeform. I'm Terry McNally, and I'm speaking with Thomas Frank, author of Conquest of Cool, One Market Under God, editor of The Baffler, that is worth checking out at baffler.com. Or thebaffler.com, and his latest book that we're talking about now is What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America. And you can learn more about all of this at his own website, which is www.tcfrank, one word, tcfrank.com. Okay, how have they pulled that off?
Well, you've really, that is the giant picture, but the thing is that if you were to say that to a Republican, they would immediately point out that, in fact, they are victims and they are on the receiving end of modern life because our culture is still being made by Hollywood and these liberal elites in academia and in the media, in the newspapers, and just turn on Fox News sometime. These people understand themselves as victims. They are on the receiving end of history. They cannot. The fact that they control all three branches of government never enters into their thinking. They understand themselves as a victimized majority fighting back for their rights. That's totally how they see themselves.
Ever the underdog.
Yeah, ever the underdog. That's a big part of the appeal of the backlash. And by the way, that's my term.
I was going to say let's slow down and tell people.
Right. That's my term for populist conservatism over the years, from the late 1960s up to the present, and it's. I consider it as all more or less one phenomenon, even though it has many different chapters and many different personalities. But we've been in this, historical stage ever since the late '60s, where conservatives have become the majority and are able to win elections in this way and that by talking about these hot button cultural issues and by using the same kind of. What would you say, conservative pop culture.
And when you say backlash, a backlash against?
Well, it originally started as a backlash against the anti-war movement in Vietnam, and to some degree is a backlash against the civil rights movement. You remember the guy who was its first great leader was
George Wallace. Yep.
Who was an overt segregationist.
I'll tell you what, let's go down this tributary right now, because one of the questions I was going to ask you is the role of race in this.
Yeah.
As much as you're saying sort of it's about these liberal elites and it's all the use of the cultural issues. Lyndon Johnson said when he signed the Voting Rights Act, I've just given the South, the Democrats have lost the South, and they did. And George Wallace, anger over integration, didn't that precede and at least for a while exceed any passion over, say, teaching evolution? And how does that fit fit into your analysis? Of course, in their minds, it probably overlapped, but that's another story.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some people who think those things go hand in hand somehow. I don't know.
But how does that fit in how does racism and the role of race, at least as maybe the booster engine that started this?
Yeah, well, that's certainly the case, that the backlash started as a more or less openly racist movement, and a lot of its early chapters were marked by racism. And you think of Nixon's famous Southern strategy. That was the whole idea. There was to put Johnson's prediction into effect, right? And you remember Goldwater, who voted against the Civil Rights Bill and who was the first Republican to win Southern states in a very, very long time. Then you have things like the Boston busing riots, or the Willie Horton, TV commercial, or the career of Jesse Helms or Trent Lott.
Right, and let's just remind people, lest they aren't aware, that the Willie Horton commercials were the brainchild of Roger Ailes, who now runs Fox News.
Oh, is that true? I didn't
Fox
know
Network.
That.
Yeah, that was his. Came out of his shop.
Yeah. But what interests me about the backlash in recent years is that it's tried to turn its back on this racist side, and in fact you have, I mean, right now in the news, one of the great exponents of pop conservatism, Alan Keyes,
Right.
a black guy running for the U.S. Senate in Illinois, and he's a very interesting guy, very intelligent, amazing public speaker, but right down the line as conservative as they come. And this is one of the reasons why I chose Kansas as my as a state to focus on, because if the backlash has a future, and I think it does, it's not in the sort of racial aspect of it. I mean,
right. In other words, what I'm guessing as I'm listening to you is that the racism was the start, and obviously the smart Nixon money was on that. But then, how long can you say we're the victims of racism? The victims of integration. That begins to get a little old.
Well,
but if
it's
you can,
also, and that's racism is something that is so thoroughly discredited.
That's what I mean.
Society. There's almost nobody will stand up.
But if you can graft on all these other things onto that same feeling.
That's right. In fact, the backlash often today tries to go the other way and tries to use and they will look for any like far-fetched, logical, whatever you call it, any far-fetched way of thinking that they can that would allow them to call Democrats racists. They're constantly on the lookout for this, whether it's the Social Security issue or school vouchers or something like that. They're always looking out for something like that because they sense that this is the power of this term. And in the way that it's been used against them. But this is one of the reasons why I focused on Kansas, is because this is a state where the racial side to the backlash is relatively small. It's basically not there. It certainly was there in the past, but the issues that get people riled there are all the culture issues, whether it's abortion, which is the big one, or gun control, or evolution, which was, as I said, was
What is the situation in Kansas on evolution right now?
Well, about a week ago, they had the Republican primary. No, it was on Thursday, so about 5 days ago, they had the Republican primary, and the conservative. We'll get into the story later, I imagine, but the Republican Party there is this is where the backlash war is being fought out there. Is within the Republican Party. You have two factions. You have the moderate Republicans, who are the old traditional Kansas ruling class, and they used to be progressive Republicans. Some of them even used to be liberal Republicans.
And is that Bob Dole? Dole's Republican
Bob
Party?
Dole would have been on the rightward edge of that, but like Nancy Kassebaum, House Landon, even Dwight Eisenhower, this kind of republicanism. And then in the last 15 years, you've had rising up this group, the conservatives, or the cons, as I call them in the book, the cons versus the mods. But the cons all come from working class neighborhoods throughout the state, and they're this is the fascinating thing. They explicitly describe their war with the moderates as a class war. It's them against the state's the rulers, the traditional rulers of the state, and they're right up front about that. They acknowledge it all the time. The interesting thing is that they're way to the right. That this class revolt that they are engaged in is a right-wing class revolt. That's what's fascinating. Well, anyhow, last Thursday they scored a huge victory over the moderates. They tend to be able to they tend to win the primaries because they have much greater commitment on their side than the moderates do, because the moderates are all on vacation in August, and the conservatives are highly motivated people, and they tend to show up on the primary day and to win. And they scored a big triumph, and they've retaken the state board of education. So they'll probably be bringing the evolution issue back in the next, year or two.
Yep.
They'll be on the lookout for that.
And you'll say, yeah, I'm from Kansas.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, I'm now a professional Kansan.
That's true.
So.
That's true. You are. Now, one of the things, and by the way, Tom, the old show I had was an hour. This one's a half hour. So we've got 10 minutes, and
is that so?
We can consider me jumping into another studio and grabbing another half hour if you've got the time.
It's actually, today is a very busy day for me. I'm sorry.
So we're going to finish then in 10 minutes. So let's go to another piece of this, which is the role of the Democrats.
Yeah.
And you at one point used the phrase, or not at one point, more than one point, used the phrase criminally stupid to describe its strategy and tactics since the 70s. You won't get many arguments in my listenership, but let's explain where they have gone so wrong.
Well, it's when I wrote the book, I was living in Chicago, and it was all more or less theoretical. And my argument was that the Democrats have turned their back on the blue-collar voters that used to be their obviously their main constituency, and
right, and still we're through the Kennedy years.
That was who made them the big, the dominant national party in the first place. Was when they sort of, in the 1930s, were able to start talking about issues of social class, economic issues of social class. Before that, we'd sort of been in this kind of, doing the sort of silly culture wars in the 1920s over prohibition and that kind of thing.
And then let's go back again and say that the original wedge was racism and was civil rights. But,
absolutely.
But then the Democrats made a bigger mistake.
In my opinion, what the Democrats have done in recent years that's been so catastrophic is to turn their backs on the traditional working class constituency by moving to the right on economic issues. And you remember Clinton doing this, triangulation they called it, whether it was NAFTA, whether it was deregulation of various industries, whether it was antitrust. He basically adopted the Reagan agenda on economic issues. And this is something that a lot of people within the Democratic Party had been calling for a long time. Their answer to every defeat, whether it's McGovern's defeat in '72 or Gore's defeat in '84,
or even Gore's in 2000.
It's always they've got to move to the right. Look, the Republicans are on the right. We've got to move over there. We've got to keep moving to the right. What's funny is that the Republicans, who started out with this own, catastrophic defeat of their own with Goldwater, they never said we gotta give in, we gotta change course. They kept at it. The conservatives kept at it, and eventually they won. But the Democrats seem to think that the way they're going to win is by constantly trimming and constantly adopting bits of the Republican platform, and then they'll be able to appeal to corporate America, and they'll get the money. They'll be able to appeal to these suburban professional voters. That's who they always talk about. Anyhow, I wrote that in the book because when Clinton signed off on NAFTA, this is, in my opinion, when disaster really commenced for these people. That's when they lost the House and the Senate.
And you quote people who I think
who changed say
that was it.
Party registration because of that. In Wichita, a very blue-collar town.
In other words, and let me just make specific, that while they didn't while the Republicans might also have been for NAFTA, they said, I used to be for the Democrats on economic issues. Once they go for NAFTA, then I might as well go to the folks who I agree with on evolution.
That's right. Or evolution hadn't come up yet.
Or
then,
abortion,
or
church, or anything. Prayer
so
in school.
There's no longer a difference between the parties on the issues that matter to me. Therefore, I'm going to vote my conscience on this one, and I'm, this is a very religious city, as many places are in America, and that's what happened there. And they lost their Democratic congressman. He was replaced by a far right-wing Republican. They lost their Democratic mayor, also replaced by a very conservative Republican. And they've been moving to the right ever since.
Okay, let me very quickly tell people, because I hate people to tune in and not know who they're listening to. You're listening to Thomas Frank speaking with host Terry McNally on Free Forum. Thomas Frank's new book
is called What's the Matter with Kansas?
Yep, and his website is tcfrank.com.
I moved to Washington a few months ago. I'd lived in Chicago all these years. I moved to Washington, and since I've been here, I have met many people that I would describe as professional Democrats. They work for the Democratic Party, or they work for some liberal group that's effectively an arm of the Democratic Party. And when I tell them these stories, and I talk to them about blue-collar issues and workplace issues, they sort of roll their eyes, and they say this. They say, there is no working class in America anymore. And I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? And they say something like, manufacturing is no longer an important part of the economy. It's only like 10% of the workforce, or something. You've heard this before.
Right.
And therefore, those voters are not important. The people we have to worry about are these suburban professionals, and they've got this all worked out in their own mind, and that's why the Democrats keep moving in the direction that they're moving. And I will guarantee you, as sure as the sun is going to rise tomorrow, that when John Kerry goes down to defeat in November, which it now looks like he's going to do, that the Democratic Leadership Council will blame his loss on the fact that he was too far to the left, and they will interpret his defeat as another call for the Democrats to move farther to the right, and this will keep going on, and they'll lose again, and maybe someday they will become what the Republicans say they are today, which is this party of the liberal elite, of these wealthy Hollywood people and these wealthy people from Silicon Valley, and that's it.
Quick question, Thomas.
Class constituency at all.
They'll blame it. They'll say, look, what can we do as long as campaigns are based on television advertising and we've got to raise the $250, $300 million the Republicans, or the 400, you name it.
Yeah.
We've got to do this. What do you say to that?
Well, it's this has been the case ever since the rise of TV, and I understand that worry, that concern. But basically, if that's the case, then then the left is done for. And I want to remind you that a guy like Franklin Roosevelt ran for office. The Democrats have always had significantly less money than the Republicans, and in 1936, when he ran against Alf Landon, who was at the time the governor of Kansas, Landon was backed by a huge majority of the newspapers of this country, and back then the newspapers were very partisan in their reporting. This was before objectivity, very partisan. He was backed by Wall Street. He was backed by every imaginable moneyed interest, and they stopped. They pulled out all the stops to elect that guy, and Roosevelt still won.
Right.
And won by a thundering landslide. It can be done.
Also,
you don't just have to have money in this. You think about these people in Kansas, who the moderates, the moderate Republicans, are the ones with all the money. And yet the conservatives have been able to beat them in election. And it's funny to be drawing our lessons from the right. It really is.
I know.
The conservatives have been able to beat them in election after election because they have more commitment.
You're saying passionate grassroots will ultimately trump TV ads.
Absolutely. These people go door to door. These people, I met one woman. These are all working class people. I met one woman who was so dedicated to the issue of school vouchers, by the way, which is itself so utterly, bewildering, because Kansas, actually, the place where she lives in Kansas, very good public schools. But she's so into school vouchers and, somehow undermining these public schools. She mortgaged her own house to further her campaign for school vouchers. These are people. She put herself into debt to fight for an issue that is going to harm people like her in the long run.
Yeah, this is the thing that drives me the craziest. Because we've only got a half an hour, I'm going to have to wrap this up. I'll come back to you in 1 second here. The book is What's the Matter with Kansas? The website is www.tcfrank.com. I've been speaking with Thomas Frank. Thank you to Maggie Lepeak, my engineer, Mark Maxwell and Stan Mizrahi in production, and Matt Perez in traffic, and to you, my listeners. I look forward to being with you again next week. In the meantime, if you have questions or comments, if you'd like CDs, tapes, or transcripts of past interviews, or if you want to get my weekly email announcements of what's coming up on the show, email me at temcnally, one word, TEMCNALLY, temcnally@att.net. You've been listening to Freeform with Terry McNally. The book is What's the Matter with Kansas? Thomas Frank, you've already decided Kerry's losing in November?
I'm not completely. I haven't completely given up. I like the guy. I like John Edwards a lot, and I'll do whatever needs to be done to help him get elected. But I'm just telling you that if they lose, and it's starting to look,
that's what they'll say.
Likely.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Thomas. Keep up the good work.
All right. Well, thank you for having me.
Okay. Hello, this is Terrence McNally. In the second half, you'll hear my 2010 conversation with Paul Loeb about his book, Soul of a Citizen, Living with Conviction in a Challenging Time. Loeb recommends a new kind of activism, an exciting spiritual model for creating social change, and the book is full of moving stories of ordinary Americans finding unexpected fulfillment in social involvement. Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to Freeform. I love powerful quotations, I love stories, and I love democracy with a small d. In this interview, we're going to deal with all three. My guest, Paul Loeb, is an activist and a collector of quotes and stories, and we're going to talk about activism in the age of Obama. But first, I'm going to read a few quotes. Indulge me here. First, from Nelson Mandela. I am fundamentally an optimist. Part of being optimistic is keeping one's head pointed toward the sun, one's feet moving forward. There were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested, but I would not and could not give myself up to despair. That way lay defeat and death. From Jim Wallace, head of Sojourners, hope is believing in spite of the evidence, then watching the evidence change. And that hope is believing in spite of the evidence is actually pretty much a quote from the Bible. The part about watching the evidence change is Jim's his own. From Cornel West, who's been a frequent guest on our show here, to live is to wrestle with despair, yet never to allow despair to have the last word. From Tony Kushner, the playwright of Angels in America, this is a moment in history that needs us to begin, each of us, every day, at her or his own pace, slowly and surely rediscovering how to be politically active, how to organize our disparate energies into effective group action, and I choose to believe that we will do what is required. From Václav Havel, hope is not prognostication. It is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. From Martin Luther King Jr., human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of men willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively and forever realize that the time is always ripe to do right. And finally, from the late and recently departed Howard Zinn. Throughout history, people have felt powerless before authority, but that at certain times, these powerless people, by organizing, acting, risking, persisting, have created enough power to change the world around them, even if a little. And finally, a couple from today's guest, Paul Loeb. Nothing cripples the will like isolation. Even in a seemingly losing cause, one person may unknowingly inspire another, and that person yet a third, who could go on to change the world, or at least a small corner of it. And one more from Paul. History shows that the proverbial rock can be rolled, if not to the top of the mountain, then at least to successive plateaus. And more important, simply pushing the rock in the right direction is cause for celebration. History also shows that even seemingly miraculous advances are in fact the result of many people taking small steps together over a long period of time. On Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, and the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, and provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, and media, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Paul Loeb has written on social involvement for the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, Utne Reader, Christian Science Monitor, Mother Jones, Salon, The Village Voice. He's been interviewed all over radio and television and lectured on more than 300 college campuses. He's the author of Generation at the Crossroads, Apathy and Action on the American Campus, Nuclear Culture, The Impossible Will Take a Little While, and Soul of a Citizen. And a new and revised edition of Soul of a Citizen is just out in paperback. His website is Paul Loeb, PAULLOEB.org. Welcome again, Paul Loeb, to Freeform.
Nice to be here.
You know, I always like to find out a bit about folks' personal path, and I like listeners to get to know the people behind the ideas and the work that we're going to talk about. So, do you consider yourself, and you can talk about origins in this as well, a writer, a teacher, an activist? How did your current path evolve?
I think all of the I check all of the above.
Right.
Because I've been writing books for 30 years now, so it's a long time, and articles before that. And at the same time, all of the work that I do, I mean, I'm not writing about dogs. I like dogs, but I'm not writing about them, and I'm not writing about cooking, even though I like to cook. I'm writing about how to make change. And so fundamentally, all of the work that I do is geared towards activism. And I think really if I look back, even since I was in high school 35 years ago, I've always been engaged in different political causes, and the work that I do comes out of that. And then as an educator, I work a lot with campuses. It's been one of the neat things with Soul of a Citizen is that literally hundreds and hundreds of campuses have been using the book and really inspiring students to act. And so I would come into the campuses or to academic conferences and just talk about ways to really take the risks of engaging students, and I've had some impact there as well. So I would argue that basically all of those elements are ones that I'm trying to work with at the same time.
And let me ask you a couple of questions that arise from just what you said. The first is, just briefly, when you say colleges use it, in other words, Soul of a Citizen is a textbook and some courses?
Oh, not some, like literally hundreds. And there's schools where like the entire, I went to a school in Georgia where it was Newt Gingrich's home district. The entire freshman class was reading. 2,500 students were reading "Soul of a Citizen." It was really interesting because, of course, they took different messages from it depending on who they
right.
were. So some of them they got involved in a literacy program. There was a campus gay rights group, but there was also an NRA-backed concealed weapons effort that some of them got involved in. And I thought, well, when you're inspiring people to act, you can't always control the trajectory. So
absolutely. Well, congratulations. I mean, that I can imagine few things could be more rewarding than to actually arrive on a campus where every freshman is reading your book.
Oh, it's really nice.
And it's not just a book about, have a few laughs or have a good story.
No. I mean, they were really engaging with it. I mean, I had great discussions in the classes.
The second one is, I don't know exactly how old you are. When you say you got involved in high school, I know we're of a slightly different generation.
Yeah.
What were the first causes?
In fact, actually, I would say middle school even. I mean, the very, very first cause. I'm 57 now, and there was it was interesting. There was a debate on the Vietnam War in my 7th grade class, and I jumped in with the cliche of the time. You got to stop them today or they'll be on the beaches of California tomorrow. And this was Los Angeles where the classroom was. And so everyone said, yeah, we don't want communist tanks on our beaches. We go surfing there. And never mind how they would get there, or that, Vietnam itself was smaller than California, let alone the rest of the U.S. But, people say the cliches of the time. And what was interesting is by another couple of years, I'd shifted and got very involved in the anti-war movement. But I got kicked out of Stanford University for activism.
Let me just share. I'm 5 years older than you, so I was actually at Boys State in Florida in 1964, and Boys State was run entirely by the American Legion in Florida at that time, and I was not yet against the war in Vietnam. I was, what really, I basically kind of was sort of a smart aleck class clown at this Boys State thing. And I thought, well, at least I'm not totally enrolling in their view of the world. And it was years later, Paul, that I realized that out of the 540 boys, juniors in high school who were chosen to be part of Boys State in Florida in 1964, not a single one was black.
Wow.
I didn't even see it. And, it's
just because it's invisible. I mean, and that's part of one of the things I talk about in Soul of a Citizen is how do you make the invisible visible? Because if you're inside something that you just take as familiar, as accustomed, I mean, you look at something like climate change. I mean, part of the challenge with it, the huge challenge, is that the consequences are deferred and they are invisible, and unless you're actually up in the Arctic watching the glaciers melt. And so, what seems like just ordinary life, in fact, is politically loaded. It is loaded with huge consequences. But we don't always see that because it's invisible.
Right. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Paul Loeb, author of Soul of a Citizen, Living with Conviction in Challenging Times, a new and revised edition just out in paperback. And you can learn more at Paul Loeb, that's PAULLOEB.org. This is Freeforum.
Soulofacitizen.org is easier to spell.
Oh, okay. Soulofacitizen.org you can go to then there as well.
Bring the words together and you'll get there.
And then you can visit me at terrencemcnally.net. That's TERRENCE, Terrence McNally, McNally, one word, terrencemcnally.net. You can learn more about the show, guests, podcasts, transcripts. You can sign up there or at iTunes to subscribe to the weekly podcast for free. And you can also sign up there or at my email address, temcnally@mac.com, for a weekly announcement that I send out telling you who's going to be on and what we're going to talk about. When you first wrote this book, 1999?
Yeah, correct.
What did you hope to accomplish with it then, and why did you, 10 years later, revise it? What did you hope to accomplish different this time around?
I wanted to, at the time, I was doing a lot of, I still am, I make my living mostly speaking around the country, and people would come up afterwards, and we'd have these conversations and then the question and answer period. And a friend of mine heard me and said, these are really interesting conversations. Supposing you pulled them all together and gave people a sense of what is it like to get involved in social change, and what are the barriers, and what are the obstacles, and how do you get past them, and how do you keep on for the long haul, all of those kinds of things. And so that was the goal, is to be able to just give people a resource. And then it kind of took off sort of unexpectedly. I mean, it wasn't very visible in the stores, but it ended up with 100,000 copies. And then after Obama was elected, I just started thinking it wasn't as if the book had ceased to be useful to people. But 1999 is a long time ago. It was before the entire Bush administration. It was obviously before Obama. It was before climate change was on the radar for most people, except for the scientists. So if you look at the world, it had shifted significantly. And it just felt like, I'm not sure that I wanted to do anything radically different, but what I wanted to do was to bring something up to the present that was still continuing to work for people, but to simply make it very useful to address the dilemmas of the present. And we face them. I mean, particularly, how do you deal, for instance, and I talk about this in Soul of a Citizen, how do you deal with the mixed presidency of Obama? That is to say, it is not everything we had wanted. It is maybe not everything we had hoped for. At the same time, God help us, imagine President McCain, or maybe he's had a heart attack and it's President Palin by now, appointing whoever to the Supreme Court, another Alito or Roberts following, already appointing one instead of Sotomayor. Clearly it was a consequential election, and from my perspective, it had a good outcome. But as one of the young women I profile in Soul of a Citizen, who started Students for Obama on Facebook and grew it to 150,000 people and then ended up coordinating the national campaign, she said people have this illusion that somehow Obama runs, here's his platforms, they automatically become policy somehow magically, and that's the way the world works. And she said, of course, that's nonsense, because it's never the way the world works. And so part of my challenge is to give people a perspective that enables them to act and empower them. I mean, one of the frustrations is, I remember I have a big email list of about 20,000 people, and when I was rewriting my chapter on burnout, maybe it was around June or July, I asked people, I said, I'd like some examples from the last 10 years of how you burned out and got past them. I got flooded with these emails that said, I'm giving up, I'm going home, Obama has betrayed me, that's the end of my political involvement. And I said, look, I wasted a lot of time in answering them.
Answering them, sure.
I know. And then I realized, no, I've got to answer them in the book. But what I realized is what a short-sighted horizon, not just to frame Obama, whatever one thinks of, various decisions, good or bad, but your own impact on history. And that's really where I'm focusing. I mean, if you look at the parallels from the Civil Rights Movement, I mean, if you look at, say, Johnson and Kennedy, their relationship to it, they were certainly very ambivalent about the Civil Rights Movement because personally they supported it, but they feared accurately enough that it was going to shatter the Democratic coalition, which it did by losing the South. And so they were spending a lot of energy trying to put the brakes on it. And it was only because people really, really pushed that Johnson then, to his significant credit, put all his political capital and skill on the line to passing the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. And so that, to me, is a sort of quintessential example of that when you mobilize from the bottom, power shifts.
Yeah, one of the most famous quotes or instances that I've referred to many times, as well as many others, is Franklin Roosevelt coming in with a very moderate platform, progressives, labor unions, farmers, and so on, hurting really badly, coming to him and saying, we need this. And he said, okay, I agree with you. Make me do it.
Right. Absolutely.
And another thing that a friend pointed out to me recently is that at this point in Roosevelt's term, I mean, relative to Obama's term in office, he had not really begun to enact much of the New Deal. At this point in Kennedy's term, he had not yet come over to civil rights.
Right.
So it's like the things we remember them for are not necessarily the things that happen immediately.
And they're after the influence of the social movements that push them to do good things. And so, yeah, exactly. It all looks so much easier and automatic and inevitable in retrospect.
But let's look at this current. Let's look at this current moment then. And first, I will be that person who gives you my response to the Obama presidency. And then let's launch that into a question. And that is sort of this, that it's more disheartening to me than it was the Bush presidency. The Bush presidency, I knew what they stood for. I saw what they were doing. I worked for change. I hoped for change, etc.
Sure.
Obama,
because you didn't expect anything out of Bush except destructiveness.
Exactly. So disheartening wasn't the thing. Anger, frustration, depression, any of those things maybe, but not this feeling of sadness or disheartenment. Now, with Obama, what I have found is that we elected on the I mean, to my view, the most progressive, electable, bright, able politician, combination of those qualities that certainly we can see, it seems to me today, and for years in the past. And what happens then is we get not, as you've pointed out, not exactly what we wanted and not exactly even what he said. And my sense is this, that what happens is in office, Republicans who basically, one of the unique things about this country, I think, and it galls people from other countries and shocks them, is that one of our main parties basically is against government. So half of the political energy in this country is against government rather than what it should do. But they are in line with their funders. Their funders want just as little government as they do. Give us our ag subsidies, but don't regulate us. And so they end up appearing to be people of conviction. They set their goal on getting to the goal line, and their funders have the same goal line, and they march forward. Maybe they get it, maybe they don't, but America sees people of conviction. Right. The Democrats espouse progressive values, or elected to enact progressive values to some extent. At least the thing that we keep hearing, is that the people actually, issue by issue, are more progressive than the Beltway or the politicians. But then when they get in, those are not the goals of their funders. And so they end up negotiating with themselves, whether it's individually within their own conscience or within their committees or within the Senate. And we end up, and America sees this, and they see, gee, they're not as wholeheartedly in favor of what they say they're in favor of. Right. I like those other guys because they're clear. Right. What do you say to that?
Well, I say a couple of things. One is that you've got to be able to build enough power on the ground to be able to overcome that, because that's just simply there with the territory. And so some of it is, in one of the stories in Soul of a Citizen, I talk about the Maine campaign finance reform effort.
Excellent.
Which then also passed in Vermont, Connecticut, Arizona. Some other states have elements of it, like Secretary of State office in North Carolina for judges. And basically, if you get enough $5 contributions, you get public matching funds to run for office. And the interesting thing is the people who put it together, the person I profiled in Soul of a Citizen, wasn't a long-time activist. She'd basically sort of gotten into it step by step. There had been a wetland destroyed right near her house, and so she got involved in environmental issues and then saw the influence of money, and that led her to sort of this broader perspective. And once it was enacted, actually, it was very, very powerful. In fact, there was even a story from Maine of somebody going up to the minority leader who was a Republican in the state Senate and saying, "Did you run on the clean elections line because it's voluntary?" Court laws, and he said he did, and the lobbyist completely walks away because he has no sway over them. And so what it does is it doesn't necessarily change, all the politics of a state, witness Arizona, but I remember talking to a legislator in Arizona, rising star in the minority because he was a Democrat in the legislature, and he was a teacher, a 7th grade teacher, and basically said there was no way I could have ever run for office, even after my students encouraged me, because I didn't know anybody with money, but this allowed me to act. And so I actually think that these are part of the discussions that we have to be able to convey to people, that there are these alternatives out there. Some of them are sort of theoretical, but in this case have been proven repeatedly. Even Arizona refused. They tried to overturn it in an initiative that some of these wealthy interests, and people lined up to support it. And so there really are models out there. So that's one thing.
Well, let me just respond to that, Paul. And by the way, I'm Terrence McNally, and the other voice you hear is Paul Loeb. He's the author of Soul of a Citizen: Living with Conviction in Challenging Times, a new and revised edition just out in paperback. You can learn more at soulofacitizen.org. The other thing that that I often say to people is, if all the people with their individual issues, individual goals, mobilized around public financing, that might be the most significant change they could make.
I would say that it would be a hugely significant change, that because it affects everything else, and so part of the problem is when they've been sort of these half-hearted coalitions that haven't succeeded, because you will get opposition and you will get mischaracterization. But it's a very, very, very powerful model. So I think that's really important, and I also think that I haven't seen yet whether this can happen on this, but one of the things I write about in Soul of a Citizen is the power of what I guess I would call unconventional alliances that I think oftentimes we forget. The example I use is on the fight around net neutrality. Critically important because it's the mechanism through which all of us communicate now. And the analogy I always use is the telephone company cannot simply say, sorry, we don't like the tone of your phone call, we're cutting you off when you're talking to somebody else.
Right.
But they can do they can't not only can, but did do the same thing when Narrow Pro-Choice America sent out or Planned Parenthood, can't remember which, sent out a text message alert. Verizon just said, okay, well, they didn't even say it. They just simply didn't pass it on, and then they discovered that essentially they'd unilaterally taken on the right to stop it. And so, this battle for net neutrality is a thing most listeners know about, and tremendously important. And it looked like, and this is after the horrible Bush FCC decision, it looked like, this is early 2006, it looked like it was going to go down. The Congress had passed a law that the telecom companies had written. The House was about to, this is before the Congress changed hands in 2006. And what basically saved net neutrality, from my perspective, was this very unlikely alliance where the founder of MoveOn.org, obviously a very progressive organization, became friends with Christian Coalition, which is very much part of the Republican right, and there was a kind of transpartisan retreat, they called it. We were actually sort of sitting together and talking with people of very widely politically diverging views. And the founder of MoveOn became friends first with the communications director and then the president of Christian Coalition, basically bonded over being moms. And
right. Sure.
They both had kids. They were just talking about their kids. And they became kind of friends by phone and email and whatnot, the way people do these days. And then when the net neutrality fight started happening, Joan Blades of MoveOn calls up the woman from the Christian Coalition and says, look, I know we don't agree on anything practically in terms of the issues, but this does affect participation for everybody, supposing we both worked on it. And the Christian Coalition woman says, great idea, let's, and they do a press conference in Washington, D.C. with 1 million names. They have a joint New York Times ad that begins, MoveOn and the Christian Coalition respectfully agree that, and that gets everybody's attention.
Sure.
Nobody's used to that. There's a joint op-ed that they write, and Christian Coalition does one with their arch enemies, Planned Parenthood, and on and on. And it works. It stops it, and recently we heard good news from Obama's FCC commissioner
That's
that
right.
they will indeed be upholding it and moving towards reversing the original ruling. And so what's interesting to me is here you have this situation where you've got people with very divergent views, but they're actually coming together on something, not by compromising their principles, but on something of genuine value. Actually, the same thing occurred where the woman from Christian Coalition met Al Gore at one of these conferences, and she was a former head of the South Carolina Young Republicans, so very conservative. Gore had never voted for Gore or particularly liked him or anything, but was really impressed by him and took his climate change training. And Christian Coalition is now lobbying together with National Wildlife Federation on climate change, which, again, is very powerful because, as she says, when we go into some Republican senators, they can't call us liberals because we're not. And so I think that sometimes on the left we get so isolated in our kind of enclaves that we forget the possibilities of reaching out to people who, may not share all of our perspectives, may not share even many of our perspectives, but nonetheless, on particular issues, we actually can find common ground.
Yeah, very good. That's the voice of Paul Loeb, author of Soul of a Citizen. We've got about 3 minutes. The thing I would, and there's lots of other things I would like to say, but I appreciate the part you've pointed out, which is basically democracy with a small d, which I pointed out is what I love at the start. It does unite everyone, I think, but the big moneyed interests. In other words, any citizen, it seems to me, wants media that informs, wants elections that are fair, wants public servants who work for them, etc., and that there is really a unity, I think, among the interests of so many of the individual people and communities and so on. And it seems to me the obstacle very often is just the biggest moneyed interest, whether it's Wall Street, oil, pharmaceuticals, etc. Do you see, especially I'm curious about campuses, you've got like 2 minutes. What do you see in terms of the mood? We hear more about the Tea Partiers or the immigration both sides of the immigration fight than anyone else. What else do you see out there? Where are people right now?
A lot of engagement. I mean, I profiled this young woman in Soul of a Citizen who started out so apathetic, as is at Virginia Tech, that her first election, instead of not only didn't she vote, but she ended up playing a drinking game where they chugged a beer each time a red or blue state flipped, went on from there to put together this pioneering climate change initiative on her campus, grow the environmental group into the largest group on campus. I was just at Northwestern University where students who got involved in the Obama campaign are now doing a living wage campaign for its employees. I think there actually is a lot going on, and the challenge is to give people models. I mean, and that's where I hope Soul of a Citizen is useful, is to say, look, you know, these are the issues you're taking on. You want to work for change. This is how people have done it in the past. This is how other people do it in the present. So because you don't want to feel isolated. That's what cripples people. And so the challenge really is to encourage that instinctive idealism, which really did well up among young people in the last couple of years, and to give them that long-haul perspective that prevents them from lapsing into cynicism, to saying, well, I tried and it didn't immediately work. Because you need to be able to say, look, it's never going to immediately work. It's always going to be a long-haul effort. I mean, I opened the book with the Soul of a Citizen with the Rosa Parks story, just pointing out that instead of the myth of the lone activist, this was somebody who acted as part of a community, who persevered a dozen years from her first NAACP meeting, who took trainings. It was a very intentional action at Highlander Center. So nothing is ever accidental in terms of change, although at the same time we never can anticipate the results of our actions. And so to me, that's what I think we have to convey, is to be able to reach particularly out to all those people who came in the last couple of years and get them re-engaged, not just from behind their computers, because there's a kind of seduction of clicking that allows people to sort of say, oh, well, I signed 3 emails today, everything's fine, I don't have to do anything more, although that's certainly a useful thing to do. But to actually get out as people did a few years ago, where they're making phone calls and they're knocking on doors and they're handing out flyers at football games and they're rallying publicly and on and on and on, because that is what changes a culture. So it's that face-to-face activism, and that's true on any of the issues that we're taking on.
Very good. The book, again, is Soul of a Citizen, Living with Conviction in Challenging Times, a new and revised edition just out in paperback, which takes into account the changes that have happened in the last 10 years, including the use of social media, although Paul clearly favors face-to-face. He does talk about that. The website...
And I do have a website. That's right, soulofacitizen.org.
The website, soulofacitizen.org, is where you can learn more about the models, find the stories, and so on. Paul Loeb, thank you again, and keep up your good work.
Absolutely. And anytime you want to talk further, I would love to.
Great.
911, what's your emergency?
America's healthcare system is broken, and people are dying.
Welcome to Code WAC, where we shine a light on America's callous healthcare system, how it hurts us, and what we can do about it. I'm your host, Brenda Gazar. This time on Code WAC, with millions of Americans poised to lose their health coverage due to cuts to Medicaid and other health programs. What can people do to protect their health and access to care? What are some of the lesser-known ways to get free or low-cost medicine and medical care if you suddenly find yourself uninsured? To find out, we spoke with Rachel Madley, Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Center for Health and Democracy.
And the other thing that I would suggest that took me a long time to learn is don't be afraid to share your concerns about being uninsured or cost of treatment with your medical providers. In my experience, medical providers have been incredibly understanding, but they also see situations like that a lot through their day because they're constantly dealing with the same insurance system that we are. If you feel comfortable with your medical provider and you have some of these concerns, let them know during the appointment. There may be resources that you don't know about, that I even never learned about being uninsured, that they can connect you with. People shouldn't have to go through this alone because we have lost so many people to them being uninsured and having to ration medication, and I don't want us to continue that trend. And so you can ask your medical providers for help. It's completely confidential.
Get the full Code WAC story on progressivevoices.com and on the PV app. Catch all our episodes by subscribing to Code WAC wherever you find your podcasts. This podcast is powered by Heal California, a nonprofit that uplifts the voices of those fighting for healthcare reform around the country. Until next time, stay healthy.
The Progressive Voices audience has grown to nearly 1 million regular listeners. Unfortunately, so have our operational costs. We feel it's important to protect the very limited commercial nature of the stream, so to keep up with these costs, we need your financial help. If you want to continue enjoying great shows like Randy Rhodes, Stephanie Miller, Tom Hartman, Leslie Marshall, and so many others on the free mobile Progressive Voices platform, please go to progressivevoices.com and press the donate button right now. Thank you.